us now on video. Gauri, help us understand what are the likely implications of this. How do you see the GSM lobby reacting to this? Are they likely to, be okay with the fact that at least there's been some sort of a concession and that we have a partial refarming, or are they likely to take the government to court because this still will hit them by several thousand crores? I think we don't have the link with Gauri yet, but we'll try and get Gauri back live as soon as possible, and also get your reactions from some industry analysts and experts as well over the next few minutes. This is a big breaking story. Also try and bring up how stocks reacted. In fact, today in anticipation of this news, we saw several stocks rally in trade. If you can bring up Bharti Airtel, Idea Cellular in trade for you. All these stocks did well. Idea marginal gains up at 85, but Bharti Airtel was a big gainer in trade because that's going to be the big beneficiary. The market over the last 6 to 12 months have priced in the fact that refarming is something that will happen, and that's why valuations of telecom companies have been beaten down significantly over the last 12 months or so. Now that we have some finality, it's definitely good news for some of these telecom companies. Also, the other reason why market is now increasingly optimistic is because they believe a lot of these regulatory overhangs are now being sorted out. One by one, some of the key contentious issues are being sorted out. Let's take it across straight to Gauri. The way you broke that story a little while ago right here on ET Now. Gauri, how are GSM players likely to react to this? Are they going to be happy with the fact that this is better than what it could have been, or are they going to challenge the government and take it to court, because this is going to hit them by at least well over 50-60,000 crores?
This is definitely better than what could have happened, really. Full refarming was something that even yesterday the DOT's internal committee had recommended. They had said that there is no reason why full refarming should not happen. So even till yesterday, what could have possibly happened was a case of full refarming. So clearly partial refarming is definitely a huge relief as far as the incumbents are concerned. Regulatory overhang to a large extent now gets taken care of, because remember, one-time fee and refarming were the two big issues that were really the regulatory uncertainties as far as this sector is concerned. Both have largely been addressed. They of course need to be sent to the cabinet, but on a broader basis the contours have been decided, and the companies have really now made peace with it. And more importantly, there is a sense that it's unlikely that a lot of litigation is expected to follow after this, because let's remember, this is something that is part of the telecom minister's migration package. He has been negotiating, discussing with the industry for months now, and finally the migration package has really emerged, in which partial refarming is the kind of relief that has been extended to the incumbents. And of course, the give and take also includes the one-time fee and the one-time hit that has really been levied on these companies.
Right. So Gauri, now help us understand what is it that will now go to the cabinet, because Minister Sibal did indicate that several other decisions now need to be taken by the cabinet as well. What all is the cabinet going to clear when it meets next later this week?
Well, Sandeep, as far as the one-time issue is concerned, that has not been sent to the cabinet. That will be sent next week, where it meets on the 8th. Beyond that, the M&A decisions that have been taken today, a lot of nitty-gritties as to how do two companies, one having liberalized, one having unliberalized spectrum, how do they buy into each other, spectrum holding, all those details that have to be sent to the cabinet. Refarming, the entire roadmap, the entire contours, that is the partial refarming, may not go to the cabinet, and the reason for that is refarming was in principle approved by the cabinet when it approved the national telecom policy. So now it's up to the DOT and the EGOM really to decide on the contours of it, in which case there's no reason for it to be sent back to the cabinet. The other issues, the M&A, one-time fee, spectrum sharing, all those decisions are likely to be sent to the cabinet, which is likely to meet on the 8th, just days before the auction begins on the 12th of November.
Okay, 8th of November is when the cabinet is going to meet and take a call on some of these issues. Important to mention that the 2G auction is of course on the 12th of November. We don't have much time. The government will have to take a decision on this before the 12th of November. That's the key point to mention here. Gauri, also help us understand what is going to be the implication. Okay, we've got Mohammed Chaudhry of PricewaterhouseCoopers who joins us on the show as well. Mohammed, thanks for chatting with us right here on ET Now. Your reactions to this, do you think it's much better than what it could have been? Industry was hit with the possibility of complete refarming, and now the government has at least gone ahead and allowed partial refarming, which means telecom companies can retain up to 2.5 megahertz in the 900 band. Your reactions?
So I'm yet to study the details of the decision which has been coming out this afternoon, but my initial view would be that it is definitely in the industry's long-term interests if any refarming that is done in a way that is staged. And that is indeed how it is normally done in most markets. So we've seen refarming happening recently in France and in the UK and in a number of other markets, and refarming is always done in a very staged manner. The precise details of what's been put forward today, one will have to study the details and find out, but certainly it looks like a step in the right direction.
Right. Mohammed, you know, the fact is that when the original proposal was mooted by the government, we had industry come up with a figure of a hit of about 1.5 lakh crores. They said that, you know, a lot of the network rollout expenditure will now be redundant. They'll have to set up networks from start. On the fact now that we are looking at a situation of partial refarming and the telecom companies will be allowed to retain some amount of spectrum, what is the likely impact of this in terms of, you know, in terms of a hit on telecom companies?
So according to the analysis that we did at PwC earlier on in the summer, we found that the current debt level in the industry is 185,000 crores in India, including external debt as well as local debt. And we found that if there was to be full refarming from 900 to 1800 megahertz, as well as participation in the auction, then taking all of the costs into account, that financing would have to go up from 185,000 crore to 500,000 crore. Clearly, as a result of today's decisions, that financing gap of 300,000 crore would likely be lower than that. But the real question is, what does it do to operators' ability to be able to finance what's needed? And just to spend a couple of moments on that, firstly, the refarming itself, what it will require is any amount of dismantling of 900 megahertz spectrum will require on average 1.6 times the number of sites to be built in 1800 megahertz compared to what exists today in 900 megahertz. And that's because when you're on 1800 megahertz, in general, the propagation quality of the signal is a little bit weaker than on 900 megahertz. So really the implication is that there will have to be quite a lot more capital expenditure, quite a lot more site construction all across India where there is refarming happening. So the real question is, what happens to operators' ability to afford that sort of capital expenditure? And as a result of that, what happens to consumers' quality of service? So two things can happen. One is that the quality of service of calls in urban areas could drop if the operators don't have enough financing to meet the capital requirements to build out networks. Secondly, of course, in rural areas, the coverage might drop in quality, and the expansion of coverage in the future may be slowed down. So those are the sorts of things that the industry will have to think through in terms of the potential implications of any refarming proposals going forwards.
Right. So, Mohammed, what about impact on tariffs? Because, you know, we've also heard operators say that tariffs could go up significantly once refarming comes into place. Now that we're looking at a situation of partial refarming, do you think the tariff impact is also likely to be minimal?
So again, we will have to do the analysis on what that impact might be. But initially what we found is that the tariff impact from a full refarming would be really quite significant. I mean, it could go as far as you know, adding 80 to 90% on top of the current average tariff level per minute for a voice call. So, and the reason why I say that is because operators are currently at a point where their borrowing capability is at a limit. Their debt to EBITDA ratio in the industry is already at 4.8. And typically any ratio above 3 raises questions amongst financiers with respect to the risk levels for lending further. So if one was to assume that further cost increases that operators have to borrow for to finance will not be met through profitability, which is likely to be the case, then of course tariffs will have to increase logically for helping close that funding gap. So to that extent, tariff increases should be a natural expectation as a result of these measures. They may not be as high as the levels that we've predicted based on the proposals of full refarming, but I would still expect that the tariff increases would be relatively significant. And given the fact that there is quite a lot of price sensitivity to voice tariffs, especially at the lower end user, who's typically mainly making voice calls, not using data services, and can be quite price sensitive to call tariffs, there may be some impact on their usage of telecoms as well.
Right. Also, Mohammed, this telecom sector over the last year or so has been really battered. Ever since, those 122 licenses were cancelled, we've seen valuations of telecom companies completely nosedive. There's been a huge amount of regulatory uncertainty. Do you think, in a way, this is a bit of a positive as well, that, the whole regulatory uncertainty is now getting sorted slowly but surely? May not be completely in the interest of the companies, but some of these issues are getting sorted, are getting ironed out, and about, in about 2-3 months from now, we'll have certainty as far as telecom policy is concerned. That's always good, isn't it?
I think we're in the middle of that storm, and therefore we're in the machinations at the moment of getting to a point where we have a greater degree of certainty. You're quite right. I mean, the Supreme Court decision of February did announce, or herald, if you like, a new chapter in Indian telecoms, a chapter from where we went from a period of very rapid growth driven by customer acquisition and very rapid network build out to a new decade of growth, which will result in operators having to be much more savvy, much more innovative in order to retain customers and develop relationships with them, because the new customer acquisition is now a thing of the past in terms of the volumes that we've had before. So the Supreme Court decision of February almost heralded the changeover, if you like, from that initial period of growth to a new period which will hopefully end up in seeing a greater degree of stability. We've not reached that point yet, and there are still some very, very important steps left, in terms of going through auctions, having clarity with respect to refarming, and also, of course, having clarity with respect to the overall telecom policy, which is yet to be finalized as well. So there's still a ways to go. The direction seems to be in the right way, but there's still a ways to go, and I would have thought that operators, both domestically owned and promoter driven, as well as ones who are owned or have a significant share from foreign investors, will continue to be very, very careful and very, very prudent about how they proceed over the next few months.
Right, Mohammed, stay with us. I want to let's listen into what Kapil Sibal spoke. Remember, you heard it first on ET Now. Let's cut across again to Kapil Sibal briefing the media after the all-important meeting of the ministerial panel on spectrum.
The first policy issue that we finalized was that in the context of acquisition by an acquirer company of spectrum which was acquired by a company which is going to be acquired by the acquirer, which was non-liberalized spectrum, that is spectrum that was acquired at an administrative price. On that a policy decision has been taken. And then in the context of that merger and acquisition, what is the price that would have to be paid if an acquiring company were to acquire spectrum which had been given to a company at an administered price, which is 1658 crores. That's one decision that has been taken. The second decision is on refarming. All those who have 5 megahertz will have to vacate the space. All the decisions that have been taken by the EGOM will be taken before the cabinet.
Okay, that's the big breaking story right here on ET Now. A ministerial panel has cleared partial refarming of spectrum in the 900 megahertz band. We have with us Mohammed Chaudhry of PwC, who joins us with his expert analysis of this big breaking news. Mohammed, also, do you see the possibility of some of the GSM companies, or maybe the GSM lobby, COAI itself, dragging the government to court? Because now this is a final decision. Kapil Sibal made it very clear that this will not need to be cleared by the cabinet. This is a final decision. Do you think we're looking at some amount of litigation from here on, or do you think the industry will just live with this reality and move on?
It's very difficult for me to call that, as you could probably expect. I think it's a decision which each operator will take, in its own course. My sense, though, is that regardless of whether there is litigation or not, the industry will still be proceeding very, very gingerly over the next few months, because there is still, some ways to go before we emerge into a position where there is a greater degree of certainty. We haven't got there yet, so my expectation is that the players in the industry will proceed with caution with respect to their decisions for now. At the same time, we do know that the market has changed. We do know that there is a greater degree now for operators to be much more nimble, much more innovative, much more able to launch and provide services that are personalized to different segments, different types of users, and with that respect, most of the operators will be focused now behind the scenes on getting themselves to a position where they can bring those sorts of offerings, in a much more aggressive way to the marketplace. So while we see regulatory uncertainty, we should not underestimate the appetite for the operators to be getting themselves ready for a new round of evolution of the industry over the next few years.
Right. Mohammed, also, I'm sure you heard the minister say as well, I think the EGOM has also taken a decision on M&A norms, because what happens if a company acquires another company that got spectrum by just paying the license fee of 1650 crores? What price should it pay for acquisition of that spectrum? That's a contentious issue as well. Should that also be linked to the price that is discovered in these auctions? That's a big bone of contention as well. What's your reaction? How can the government come up with a balanced policy on this, on M&A?
So I think with M&A, again, we're in a period of time now when M&A is less likely, or at least there's a less conducive environment for M&A right now as we speak, only because of the uncertainty levels there. Also because we're just in the advent of an auction that will take place over the next few weeks. And valuations between buyers and sellers at this point in time would likely be difficult to close, if you like, on agreed prices and so on. So M&A at the moment, I think, is unlikely to be happening. Of course, having said that, one of the reasons why the environment is not so conducive is because of the lack of clarity on some of the M&A guidelines. So it is important that those get sorted out. Access to spectrum is, of course, critical for that, because a lot of the value that lies in some of the operations in the market, in the industry today, is around spectrum, because customer value, will be limited for many operators, where ARPU levels are low, and even operating profitability levels are very low. So really, spectrum does end up becoming a very, very key asset. But as we say, we'll just have to see what the government determines over the next course of discussions, with respect to that.
All right. We've also got Kunal Bajaj joining us on the phone line, another tall industry expert. Kunal, thanks for chatting with us on ET Now. Your reactions to the government's move to allow partial refarming. Do you think it's a bit of a reprieve for large GSM operators who are staring at a precarious situation of complete refarming?
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. I absolutely think that this is a very positive move on behalf of the government, because the major financial implications that the industry, particularly the incumbents who are operating at 900 megahertz today, were worried about was that if there was no 900 that they could retain, that they would run into two big problems. One is of 900 megahertz equipment that could not be upgraded to 1800 megahertz, and therefore would basically have to be written off. And the second is that it's much more difficult to fill all the coverage gaps with 1800 megahertz networks and with 900 megahertz. So even with 2.5 megahertz of spectrum, though it's not a very large amount, you certainly can't run an entire network off of it, but at least that bit of a reprieve will be there where the existing equipment can be shuffled around and those really tough to reach places can at least be serviced using 900 megahertz in that 2.5 megahertz that they'll be able to retain.
All right, we've also got Rajan Mathews, Director General of Cellular Operators Association of India, the lobby that represents large GSM operators. Rajan Mathews, thanks for chatting with us on ET Now. I know you don't like the word refarming, but I guess it's a word that the industry now has to live with. It's not complete refarming, it's partial refarming. Do you see it as a reprieve?
Not at all. We see this as a non-starter because when you look at the sliver of spectrum that's been proposed, 2.5, there are some technical challenges one would look at. For one thing, when you have 2.5 megahertz of spectrum, not all of it is utilizable for voice or data. Some of it has to be kept for administrative purposes, like, for example, signaling. And also the trunking efficiencies are reduced substantially. So no operator in his right mind is going to be amenable to keeping just 2.5 megahertz of spectrum. We'd rather take 0 and go to 100% 1800. It makes a lot more sense to do that. So in our mind, this is absolutely a non-starter for us.
Okay, it's a non-starter, says Rajan Mathews. Arvind Subramaniam of BCG also joins in on the phone line. He tracks the telecom sector very closely. Arvind, your reactions? Rajan Mathews of COAI says partial refarming, allowing telcos to retain 2.5 megs in 900 band, is a non-starter. It's too little. Your views?
Hi, Sandeep. Good evening. So I think what the Telecom Commission has recommended and the EGOM seems to have approved is sort of the middle ground. Among the extreme options of trying to refarm everything, which was increasingly being seen as impractical, and the incumbents being allowed to retain all of their 900 megahertz, which meant that new entrants would never have a similar quality of service and coverage that the incumbents had. I guess they've tried to find some kind of a middle ground between the two. I think, I do appreciate the points Rajan made about the signaling network and the practicality of implementing a 2.5 megahertz 900 kind of network. With that being said, I do think this strikes a good compromise between the two extremes.
Right, let's take it across again to Rajan Mathews. Rajan, so what next? Do you think it's almost a given then that this will be legally challenged? Because Kapil Sibal has made it clear that this is a final decision. It's not something that's going to be cleared by the cabinet. This is a final decision, says Kapil Sibal. Will the COAI challenge it legally?
First of all, just to comment, you can't be half pregnant on these things. You need the adequate amount of spectrum. You can't divvy up a baby into two and expect that that's an adequate compromise. So that being said, addressing the issue of the alternative, I think there hopefully is scope for the cabinet to take a look at this. I think never say die till it's all over. But I think given the scope and the implications of what is involved in spectrum refarming of this magnitude, 500 million consumers to be moved to an alternative, simply doesn't make sense. So I think if the cabinet fails to take this under advisement and go through a full-fledged, robust evaluation, I think, yes, operators will be looking very carefully. We will wait to see what the final terms and conditions are, what the fine print is, and then once we've reviewed that, I think we will be looking very carefully at the legal options.
Right, but Rajan, I mean, just to play the devil's advocate here, it's not as if it's a dire situation, because even though the government allows operators to retain 2.5 megs, they can always go out there and bid and take back the additional spectrum in the 900 megahertz band by paying the market determined price. So it's not as if it's been taken away. What do you have to say to that argument?
So, when you say that, you can go into the marketplace and buy it back, first of all, one has to look at the terms and conditions of the market or the license, which talks about an extension, not a renewable. So again, we have to take that into context. But your point that, hey, we can go back into the auction market and buy back the spectrum. First of all, that whole process really puts the whole issue at risk as to whether you will get it back. or how much you will get back. So our point of view is that, listen, there are alternative ways of determining what market value is for the spectrum. So our point of view again is that you leave the spectrum, because we know how to use it best, have used it best, and will continue to be the most efficient users of the spectrum. Determine what the market price, not necessarily through an auction determined price, but through an auction adjusted price. So once you know what, for example, in the 2G spectrum auction is going to be, we can make certain parameterizations off of that. For example, I have heard nothing to say how 800 megahertz is going to be quote-unquote refarmed, and how the level playing field is going to be set at those of us who have to all of a sudden pay 900 at market price, but those who have 800 continue to retain it for a considerable period of time. All right, so here again, the TRAI itself has said, listen, your 800 is at 1.3. If 800 is at 1.3, 900 certainly can't be at more than 1.3. So there are mechanisms to adjust to market-oriented price without having to go through a full-oriented reorbed confiscation, if you will, or taking away of spectrum.
Right. So, Rajan, also help us understand the broader implications of this, because I know a study was done and we came out with a few. You've got Mohammed Chaudhry as well, who was part of that study, which said that tariff implication is significant, and network costs could be to the tune of 1.5 lakh crores. That's the kind of hit on the industry. Now that we're looking at a situation where there's going to be partial, not total refarming, what to your sense is going to be the likely hit on the industry?
So clearly, I will be very, very surprised if any operator opts to take just the 2.5 megahertz of spectrum. I think they will be evaluating whether they would move to a new block of 1800. One, it's cheaper. Two, you have a whole block. Three, it's much more efficient to use in terms of you know, the efficiency of the use of the network. So clearly, what one would then see in that particular context is a write-off of some 20,000+ crore rupees worth of an impairment charge, because all of that equipment obviously becomes unusable. All right, that's the first thing. The second thing is that services are going to deteriorate tremendously, because no operator in his right mind who's decided to migrate off of the 900 is wanting to invest any further in the 900 megahertz spectrum network. So what you're going to see over the next year and a half is a tremendous deterioration in terms of the consumer experience. What that will then turn out to is in terms of a loss of consumers, or a hit on revenue. So consumer or operators are going to have to balance that. And then you're going to have to look at what is involved in terms of perhaps going to 1800, which means that there's possibly a 20 to 30% increase in the number of cell sites that will be required. Given the types of money that is being sucked out of the industry, it is very unclear as to whether we will be able to replicate the type of coverage that we have. So there may be considerable periods of time when the coverage is not replicated, and there will be gaps in coverage, and invariably what is going to happen, that perhaps the rural areas will suffer more than the urban areas because of the revenue impacts from those two spheres. So altogether, when you look at that, then you look at the price impact on the consumer, and clearly there's going to be an upward pressure on prices as a result of the write-off, the OPEX, CAPEX that's required by building out the new required network, and then transitioning to that. So altogether, a very, very dark scenario for the industry that has 900 megahertz.
But Rajan, the concern on business continuity was also raised by the industry, and we've had the government to address that primary concern, that business continuity will also take a hit, allow this partial refarming. Are you saying that with 2.5 megahertz, the concern of business continuity is not addressed, that is not sufficient?
Absolutely. As I indicated, 2.5 megahertz is absolutely inadequate. It's inefficient. It doesn't give us the required, volumes that we need. People who are going to be faced with that particular challenge, as I indicated, would probably be better off going to the 800. So again, 2.5 would be a non-starter. We would be looking at migrating to that. We would be looking at trying to get the spectrum that would be available in 800. We would have this parallel time period when you'd have to continue a 900 megahertz network, which is considerably deteriorating over time, building out in parallel in 1800, and on that magical day to try and move 500 million consumers or so circle by circle into this new network, which again, as I said, never been tried anywhere in the world. TRAI itself acknowledge that this is going to be a considerable logistical exercise, perhaps a nightmare, and we ought to tread into this area extremely carefully, which is why we have suggested that the cabinet look at this. We are hoping that saner minds will prevail at this particular point. Go to the TRAI, do a robust analytical evaluation as we have done at the full implications, and then make a decision. We are not convinced that as of today, this decision on refarming is based on adequate consideration of the implications of what is involved.
Okay, you're saying you're not convinced that this decision has taken into account the key concerns of the industry. Final word from you, Rajan Mathews. We're just about a week or so away, in fact 12 days exactly away from the 2G auction. Given the backdrop of all these decisions taken by the government, which should have a bearing on the auction, do you think it's going to be a flop?
We had previously indicated that with the high reserve prices that the whole 2G auction was going to be less than what the government had expected, and it's exactly what we've seen. No incremental new operators that have come in and wanting to bid. Even the very existing operators, very sort of limited type of choices that they're looking to do. Just one or two that are perhaps looking at a possible pan-India footprint. Clearly not expected to go much above the reserve price. So all told, not the types of robust activity and end results that the government was looking for. This particular decision about refarming engenders an additional amount of uncertainty, which can only hurt and not help the whole auction process.
All right, Rajan Mathews, Mohammad Chaudhry, thank you so much for joining us right here on ET Now with the analysis of that big decision taken by the ministerial panel on spectrum. It's something that you heard first right here on ET Now. The government has gone ahead with the decision to go forward with partial refarming, which means telecom companies will be allowed to retain 2.5 megahertz of spectrum in the crucial 900 band. They'll have to return all the spectrum that they have in excess of that at the time of license renewal, and if they want more spectrum, they'll have to pay market determined price and get that back. This is a big decision that will have an impact on all large telecom operators, Bharti Airtel, Vodafone and Idea Cellular. It could have been much worse because the government was earlier exploring the idea of going in for full refarming, so it is marginal reprieve, but as Rajan Mathews of COAI was saying, it's still not good enough, and that operators are likely to challenge this legally. That's it then on this special telecast of this big breaking news. News and updates continue right here on ET Now.